Chicago looked beautiful at night, but beautiful things hide rot very well. At the top of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan stood the famous architecture firm, Sterling and Vane. By day, it was full of wealthy clients, expensive suits, and people who designed the future. By midnight, it became silent. That was when Sophie Vance arrived. Most employees never noticed her. Some thought she cleaned the offices. Others treated her like part of the furniture. She moved quietly through endless rows of blueprints and forgotten files. Heavy footsteps, loose sweaters, coffee stains on old folders. Nobody looked at her long enough to remember her face. And that was exactly why Sophie saw everything. She noticed the missing documents, the altered signatures, the strange late-night transfers hidden inside project accounts. At the center of it all was one name, Julian Vane. A year ago, Julian had only been the charming junior partner. Now he walked through the office like he owned the building itself. Confident, untouchable, smiling too easily. And then there was Grant Sterling, the founder, the genius architect who built the company from nothing. Now he sat alone in his office every evening, pale and confused, staring at blueprints he no longer seemed to recognize. People whispered that he was sick, burned out, losing his mind. But Sophie didn't believe that. Because one night, while organizing old archive boxes in the basement records room, she found something strange. A private ledger, hidden behind inactive project files. Inside were millions of dollars moved through a company registered in Delaware. The approvals carried Grant Sterling's signature, but the dates made no sense. Grant had been hospitalized that week. Sophie's hands went cold. Then she found something worse. A deleted voicemail file. The recording crackled softly. Grant's weak voice whispered, "If anything happens to me, check the Marrow account." The message ended suddenly, as if someone had cut it off. And for the first time, Sophie realized this wasn't just corruption. Someone inside Sterling and Vane was slowly destroying Grant Sterling. And the killer wore a tailored suit. The next morning, Sterling and Vane looked normal again. Designers laughed near the coffee machines. Assistants rushed through glass hallways. Expensive shoes clicked across marble floors. But Sophie could not stop thinking about the voicemail. If anything happens to me. Those words stayed inside her head all night. So she started digging deeper. Every evening after the office emptied, Sophie searched the archive system. Old contracts, deleted emails, financial records hidden inside inactive projects. And slowly, a pattern appeared. Money was disappearing, not in large amounts, small pieces at a time, quiet enough that nobody noticed. But Sophie noticed. The transfers always led back to the same place. Vane Urban Holdings, Julian's shadow company. Then something even stranger happened. Grant Sterling began getting worse. One night Sophie saw him standing alone beside the model room, staring at a miniature skyscraper he had designed years ago. He looked lost. When he turned toward her, his eyes were tired and unfocused. "Do I know you?" he asked softly. Sophie froze. She had worked there for 5 years. Before she could answer, Grant suddenly grabbed the table for balance. His hands were shaking badly. That was when Sophie noticed the pill bottle in his pocket. Different label, different doctor. The next night, she searched medical invoices hidden inside executive expense files. And her blood ran cold. The doctor treating Grant was connected to Julian. Not publicly, privately, through another shell company. Sophie finally understood the truth. Grant Sterling was not naturally falling apart. Someone was helping. Meanwhile, Julian Vane walked through the office brighter than ever, smiling, confident, untouchable, as if he already owned the future. But one evening, while Sophie copied another hidden ledger, she heard footsteps behind her. Slow footsteps. She turned carefully. Julian stood at the archive door, watching her. And this time, he was no longer looking through her. Julian Vane smiled the way predators do before they bite. The archive room suddenly felt smaller. "You work late, Sophie," he said calmly. She nodded once. Julian stepped closer. His expensive cologne mixed with the smell of old paper and dust. Then his eyes dropped to the folders in her hands. For one long second, neither of them spoke. But Sophie understood something terrifying. Julian was testing her. The next few days changed everything. Security cameras appeared near the archive hallways. Access passwords were updated. Employees started whispering that someone inside the company was leaking information. And strangely, the jokes about Sophie became louder. People laughed when she entered elevators. Someone placed a broken chair beside her desk with a note that read, "Structural failure." Julian never insulted her directly in private. That made it worse. He wanted her uncomfortable, nervous, small again. But Sophie had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she was tired of shrinking. Meanwhile, Grant Sterling had brief moments of clarity. One evening, Sophie secretly replaced his pills before a meeting. The difference was immediate. For the first time in months, Grant looked awake. He stared at a building model across the room and whispered, "I designed that after my wife died." Then his face slowly darkened. "They told me I already forgot that." That night, Grant finally admitted the truth. Important documents had disappeared from his office. Julian controlled his schedule, his medication, even his personal calls. Someone had turned his own life into a prison. But the biggest surprise came from Elena, Julian's fiancée. Perfect clothes, perfect smile, cold eyes. At least that's what Sophie believed. Until Elena quietly approached her in the parking garage and handed her a sealed envelope. Inside were private bank transfers connected to Julian. Elena's voice trembled slightly. "I think he's lying to all of us." For the first time, Sophie realized Julian's empire was cracking from the inside. But later that night, Sophie returned home and froze at her apartment door. It was unlocked. Nothing inside was stolen. Nothing moved. Except for one thing. Her old architecture sketchbook sat open on the table, and across her favorite drawing, someone had written, "You were never meant to carry this much weight." The final meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. Top floor, boardroom 17. The room was famous inside, sterling and vain. Glass walls, black marble table, cold sunlight pouring over Lake Michigan like silver steel. Everyone believed they were there to witness Grant Sterling step down peacefully. Julian arrived first. Perfect suit, calm smile, controlled voice, like a man already celebrating victory. Lawyers filled the room. Investors whispered quietly. Elena sat near the far end of the table, pale and distant. Then Grant entered. Slowly, weak, but clearer than before. And behind him came Sophie, holding a stack of gray folders against her chest. Several executives exchanged amused looks. One man even smirked. Julian leaned back in his chair. "Careful with those folders, Sophie," he said loudly. "We wouldn't want the floor collapsing under pressure." A few nervous laughs escaped around the table. Sophie did not react. She walked calmly to the center of the room and placed the folders down one by one. Then she looked directly at Grant. Not Julian. Grant looked back at her with tired eyes. And suddenly the room became very quiet. Sophie opened the first folder. Inside were bank records, shell companies, medical invoices, forged approvals. Every hidden transfer Julian thought nobody would ever connect. The silence changed instantly. No one moved. Julian's smile slowly disappeared. "That's impossible," one lawyer whispered. But Sophie kept speaking. Steady, calm, precise. She explained everything. The poison medication, the stolen assets, the manipulation, the slow destruction of Grant Sterling's life. Then Elena reached into her purse and quietly removed her engagement ring. She placed it on the table beside Julian. "I checked the accounts myself," she said softly. "She's telling the truth." Julian finally lost control. He stood up violently, shouting at everyone in the room. Accusing Grant. Accusing Sophie. Accusing Elena. But nobody listened anymore. Because for the first time, people were truly looking at Sophie Vance. Not through her. At her. Then the boardroom doors opened. Two federal investigators stepped inside, and Julian Vane's empire began collapsing before the city skyline itself. By Monday morning, the entire city knew the story. News channels surrounded Sterling and Vane. Reporters crowded the sidewalks. Headlines called it the biggest corporate scandal Chicago had seen in years. Julian Vane disappeared behind closed investigations. And inside the glass tower, something strange happened. People suddenly noticed Sophie. Employees who once ignored her now moved aside in hallways. Executives tried speaking gently to her. Some even apologized. But Sophie understood something important. Most people were not sorry for how they treated her. They were sorry she mattered now. Grant Sterling slowly recovered over the next few weeks. The fog in his mind began lifting. He returned to the office one quiet evening and found Sophie alone in the archive room again. Only this time, he brought coffee for both of them. "You saved my life," he told her. Sophie looked down at the old blueprints spread across the table. "No," she said softly. "I just stopped pretending not to see." A few days later, Grant offered her a permanent executive position inside the company. A powerful title. A corner office. More money than she had ever imagined. But Sophie surprised him. She said no, because she no longer wanted to survive inside buildings designed by people like Julian. She wanted to create something different. Something honest. Months later, Sophie rented a small studio near the river. Quiet place. Exposed brick walls. Huge windows facing the city skyline. And for the first time in years, she began drawing again. Not luxury towers. Not monuments for wealthy men. She designed spaces for people who felt invisible. Shelters. Libraries. Healing centers. Warm buildings filled with sunlight and silence. Her first project had a simple name. The Quiet House. One early morning, Sophie stood alone on a rooftop watching dawn spread across Chicago. Cold wind moved through the sleeping streets below. The city looked unfinished, like something waiting to become better. And as the first light touched the glass towers around her, Sophie finally understood something. Silence had never made her weak. Silence had taught her where truth hides.